I'll do a video giving some top tips on risk assessment. So let's jump into my top tips for risk assessment.
How much more do you want out of it?
The answer to that is...
Hey everyone, been a while since we've done a YouTube video. Just catching up on my guilty pleasure, which is watching other business vlogs. Today, I'm doing a load of work on risk assessment. So we've got a project that we're doing with for a risk assessor customer, where we're helping them onboard risk assessor into the business. I'll do a video giving some top tips on risk assessment. So let's jump into my top tips for risk assessment. So tip number one is the layout of the document. This seems... Who is texting me? So the layout of a document is tip number one, and it might sound pedantic, might sound, well, this is not important, because a risk assessment is more than a document. Totally agree. Totally agree. However, how we structure a document nudges our behaviours. So I think it's really important to think about how we are structuring the document. So the most important thing I think we need to think about on structuring a document is that we are individually identifying hazards, and that becomes a row on the document, and we are identifying the control measures for that hazard. So ideally what I'd like to see on a structure of the document is hazard, who's interacting with that hazard or who might be harmed by that hazard, and what are you doing about it. That is essentially all you're doing in a risk assessment, and that should be hazard by hazard. Now if you're doing task, that's fine. You kind of, if you think about it like as an Excel spreadsheet or a Word table, you might have like task step, hazard for that task step, and then but you would still line the control measures and who will be harmed for each hazard. And the HSE have published a paper on the pitfalls of risk assessment, and that was one of them, not aligning hazards with control measures. So align your control measures with your hazard, design your document to enable that, and it will nudge you to do a better risk assessment. That's tip number one. I'm going to do some work. Here's tip number two. Don't put generic BS in there like this one that is on the RAMs I'm just proofing now. Noisy tools will be avoided. Alright, thanks. What tools? Are you avoiding them? So if they're being avoided, is the hazard not applicable then? If it's not applicable, it shouldn't be on the fucking risk assessment, should it? So don't put BS statements like that, like these aspirational statements. They're just so nothingy. They don't mean anything. Put things you're actually doing. So being like, the tools for this job are this tool and this tool, and the exposure when drilling into concrete is this, which you can get from the manufacturer of the tool. It's not hard. Don't make aspirational comments. The worst of it, these are written by a health and safety professional, which just infuriates. You think it's protecting you and your business? It's not. It's the complete opposite. The prosecution, should something go wrong, hopefully it doesn't, should something go wrong, the prosecution will tear you apart. They'll just use that risk assessment against you. So don't write generic BS. Here's the next tip. I don't understand whether this is a tech issue or a people issue, but see a lot of RAMs recently that only have like one control measure, mitigation, whatever you want to call it, one thing that's improving the risk for each hazard. So it doesn't make sense to me. Normally there are multiple things a business does. So one of two things are happening here, right? One, you're underselling yourself because you've done loads of things to manage that hazard and you just are not doing a very good job of recording them, or you are not doing enough, and that's why there's nothing there, right? So let me show you. Here we go, for example. As I understand, we have one hazard. This is really good. Like, we've got activity, risk and hazard, matrix, take it or leave it, and then we've got control measure. Really like it. It's missing who could be harmed, but that aside, but only one control measure each time. So yeah, I don't understand it. If you're doing a lot more for the management of risk in that process, so detail it in the document. I think a lot of businesses are underselling themselves when they're doing risk assessments because they're not detailing the amount of work that they're actually putting into to create a safe job. Okay, my next tip would be, don't be afraid of tech. Now, I give a little bit of a bias here because we own a risk assessment tech, but this is coming from me, who used to use a file of facts to organise everything, right? Went through this process, got introduced to Risk Assessor Pro, which is our software and health and safety RAMS app. So when we acquired Risk Assessor, we really started to realise the potential of tech. Now, for me, what the document does is slow the process down, but it's necessary, right? So documents are necessary. So what tech does is it takes out the pain of the document writing to enable you as the business owner, business manager, safety professional to focus on doing the proper stuff, which is facilitating a conversation to identify hazard, identify interaction with hazard, and identify a way to mitigate the risk of that interaction. That's it. So if we can reduce the load of paperwork, reduce the actual time it takes to produce a document, and so we can focus on the real stuff, that's good. That's what tech should do. And I think, warning, advert coming, I think that's what Risk Assessor does very, very well. Don't be afraid of tech. Don't be afraid of Risk Assessor. It's a bit of work up front to get it up and running, but if you do that, Risk Assessment will be so good, they'll be better and quicker. And it's dirt cheap, people. It's like 120 quid for the year. Why would you not? Yep, you know. The other thing that people really struggle with risk assessments is when do we make them generic and when do we make them site specific? Well, ultimately, the tasks you are doing will probably be generic, right? If you're fitting a distribution board here, it's the same as fitting a distribution board there. But the difference is the building, the site, the environment, the day, all of that stuff, which is really hard to manage. I think also that's where tech comes in really, really well. Again, plug for Risk Assessor, but I think what we do there with being able to take pictures for your hazard identification is just way ahead of so many of our competitors. I think the ability to actually run a live risk assessment, so sack off all of this dynamic risk assessment, extra paperwork bullshit, just have a live risk assessment. I love it. Bit of me, that. But ultimately, where do we find the balance? Now, if you're not using tech, I think what you should do is have a library of task-based risk assessments. So a library of risk assessments that just generically look at the task, the risk of the task, e.g. the risk of welding, UV, fumes, etc. And then when you go to the job, you would say this task applies, and the risk of doing that on this site is this, this, and this. So you would basically have like a central risk assessment that joins the task to the site. That's the stuff you would do per project, but the task ones you would just kind of drag and drop over. We've seen this done, and we've done this in businesses, and it's worked really well. Now, when you go over to risk assessor, you don't really need to do that because you create hazard libraries that are all of that task stuff and all of that kind of general building stuff. You kind of do that and it's sitting there in the back of house. That's why it takes some time to build up in the initial onboarding process. But ultimately, once you've done that, that generic task-based stuff is just sitting there, and all you have to do is just click on the thing or drag it onto a picture, whichever way you want to do it, and boom, you've got a risk assessment. So yes, there are generic aspects to risk assessment. The tasks are generic, but there's always a dynamic nature of it, which is the site in which you are doing it. So you have to consider how that task interacts with that site. So yes, everything is the same, but actually it's not. So I understand your frustration of like, well, you know, welding is welding. Yeah, it is. But welding at a school is very different from welding at a hospital, is very different from welding at an events venue, is very different from welding at your controlled workshop. Hope that helps. Okay, so they're my top tips for risk assessment. I hope that helps. If you need some help with this stuff, come and check out riskfluentltd.com if you want some consulting help, because we basically just do these with our customers, someone at my door. Or you can go to riskassessor.net if you want to do this stuff with tech. Catch you later. Safe.